48 contiguous states on a big sheet of paper with 2 little notches for the islands of Hawaii and
So he's about, this guy, here's what I would predict. I predict that Second Thought has read How to Hide an Empire.
Alaska somewhere in the corner. It's a map that's meant to tell us what the US is, and the map says that this is pretty much all there is. But that's not true. Hold on, let me show you. I have some other maps. Here's what I mean. When you look at maps like these, they make it immediately obvious what you're looking at. Empires. States that exert power over their subordinate geographies and the people who live there. States that expand over time, often overseas, to quash their new imperial holding sovereignty, either through territorial annexation, military pressure, economic extraction, direct political control, or usually all 4 of those at once.
Is not as good.
Most of us don't really see the US the same way.
Doesn't have the
During
same
the 20th century, we saw basically every existing empire, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, shrink dramatically when colonized people on just about every continent fought for their independence. Yeah. Since then, there's been a general feeling that we just don't live in an age of empires anymore. And we have maps, like this one, or this one over here, that show the US as a contained, mostly isolated blob to back that up. But maps like these lie. They conceal and minimize the true extent of American power. They hide its true nature as more of an empire than a typical country. So in this video, I want to shed some much needed light on the 3 main ways that the US became the global empire that it is today. Its literal
Probably what do you think his three ways are? I would say the 800 military bases. I would say dollar hegemony, controlling, or i.e. controlling the financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system, if you will. And I don't know, what else do you think it is? Technological innovation? Let's see what he says.
Colonies, its military, and the central role that it's come to occupy in the global economy. Let's start with the colonial territory of the US, because this is probably the most obvious and overlooked.
So I was pretty much right, I would say. I thinking about how the United States is not a typical empire, and I say this a lot on stream, that the United States is unlike empires from the past because they don't necessarily conquer territory anymore. I'm always right, yeah, of course. But we have a pointillist empire now. We don't need to control large swaths of territory. That has become, in the same manner that Israel doesn't necessarily need to have a military occupation of the Gaza Strip in order to control and exercise effective control. That's because colonialism and the nature of occupation has changed due to military technological advancements. And the same could be said for the concept of an empire. Being that, we project, or we have empire status because we can project military power through these bases that we set up. And now we have floating bases known as aircraft carriers, and but in addition to our 800 plus military bases worldwide, which no other country comes anywhere near close. Russia has a handful of bases and that are outside of its territory, and none of them are in the Western Hemisphere. And China has 1 foreign military base, as I understand it, and that is in the Horn of Africa, at Djibouti, right by where the Yemenis and the Houthis are lobbing rockets in the Red Sea, and some people wonder if China's going to get involved, but I think, like John Mearsheimer contends, for example, that China's just sitting back laughing at the United States, and it wants the United States to be bogged down in all these proxy wars. So that's perhaps explains its neutral stance. I wish that it would project more pressure on the West to stop this genocide, but so far it's geopolitics as usual. But anyway, yeah, the whole The whole pointillist empire, I find that's an interesting concept that I try to share with you. And if you follow the stream, I'm sure you hear me say things over and over again. But are the USA and France the only ones who have empire status? Well, I would say that France is now a lieutenant of the United States. I mean, France, I don't know much about France, but I would say that France at one point was an empire, you could argue. But that is definitely not the case, and I would say that the USA is the sole unipolar hegemon, and I would say that it has, I would say that Western Europe is baked into United States power. It's part of that apparatus, largely. I know that's a broad statement, but I think it's largely true.
Looked aspect of the American empire. Now, the US started as a settler colony right off the bat. Most of us are familiar with America's expansion from the original British colonies in the east going west to cover this whole area we know today.
Yeah, you like that?
Westward.
In the process, displacing and genocide.
It's 8:20 here, okay? It's it's Friday night, and you've barely condemned your hummus. So I'm trying to ask you, is everything okay? Because you barely condemned hummus today. Don't forget that you need to condom hummus.
Fighting the native populations that stood in the way. Millions of people were killed, and millions of
Pirate history? No, I haven't seen that.
acres of land had to be stolen and resettled by American colonists to form the borders that we're all familiar with. But it didn't stop there.
No, it
to go
didn't.
global, this project of manifest destiny had to start extending beyond the physical borders of North America. And that process created a US that looks very different from what
he's just casually talking about Nazi shit. When I hear manifest destiny, I think about one word: Lebensraum.
you usually think of. Here, take a look at this map. This used to be called the Greater US. And this is what it looks like when you isolate the American parts.
The greater United States, like the greater Israel, right?
Here you have, to a more accurate scale, the map we all know. The continental US, Alaska, and Hawaii are there, of course, but you also have the various territories under formal US control in 1941. Guam, American Samoa, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, the Pacific outlying islands, and the Caribbean outlying islands. Various territories with different legal statuses, most of which are still under US rule today, with a few of them almost as large or as wide as the mainland. What's crazy about this map is, well, first, the fact that it shows what we usually think of as the US as just one of many parts of a vast collection of territories. But also, it's crazy to think just how many people are actually represented here. Back in the 1940s, the inhabited territories outside the states had a combined population of 19 million people, meaning if you lived under the US's jurisdiction in any of the places on this map, there was about a 1 in 8 chance it wasn't here. But there's almost no
wild.
chance that the rest of the population ever thought of things that way. Back in the 1940s, Americans on the mainland probably never regarded themselves as co-citizens with those living in US territories or thought of those places as American. To be fair, that's probably still true today for places like Guam or Puerto Rico. Not for any nefarious reasons necessarily, but because odds are that most Americans just wouldn't hear about them. According to Daniel Immerwahr, the author of How to
There
Hide
you
an
go.
Empire,
I
the
knew it.
average mainland American in the 1930s was
Come on,
about
didn't I call it? Chat, didn't I call it? I told you, he's either going to mention it or he's read it, and this is what he's basing it off of. It's a great book. And I encourage everyone to read this book.
about twice as likely to hear about Brazil or Poland in the newspaper than a place like the Philippines, a territory with some 10 to 15 million people living under US rule. That's a very different reality than for those who lived in these US territories. You simply couldn't escape daily life under the empire and your secondary status within it. Occupation, colonization, or whatever it was called in your specific area usually meant saluting the Stars and Stripes, being forced to learn English and US history at school, using American dollars, and celebrating things like Thanksgiving. Most of the time, doing all of this without the same guarantees of constitutional rights as on the mainland, with little say in the government that dictates your daily life, and usually being subject to a lot of colonial violence to boot. Fast forward a bit, and this sort of territorial control
and experimentation. The U.S. military would perform experiments for, weapons that they hadn't tested on the battlefield. They would go and test them on Hondurans, let's say, for example. I mean, just awful shit,
expanded during World War II. Adding to the likes of Guam, American Samoa, and the Philippines, the US gained massive territorial holdings during the war by occupying parts of Germany, Korea, Japan, and Austria, for example. We don't usually think of these as territorial growth, but to give you an idea, at the end of 1945, there were more people living under American rule outside the mainland than within it. With the new occupations, 135 million people lived under US control, but weren't on the map that hangs in every classroom. It's not until very recently that this country stopped looking a lot like the British Empire. But things changed dramatically after World War II. After the war, two things happened. The US simultaneously decolonized and actually gave up a lot of occupied territory that it had acquired over the last century, but at the same
because there was also at that time, people were sick of war, they just there was the biggest, most catastrophic human event in history, and it was a strong sentiment about being, letting indigenous people have their fucking land again. And so yeah, and that also happened after World War I, as I understand it correctly. Of course, Woodrow Wilson didn't really follow through with that, but there was a strong, rhetoric surrounding that. But I think after World War II, you started to see places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. They want to take control. And it makes sense because there's a change. There's a power shift. Like, take Indonesia, for example. As I understand it, it went from Dutch controlled to Japanese controlled to then Americans tried to control it, and then you had Sukarno who was able to steer the course for Indonesian nationalism, and they shirked off their colonial oppressors for at least some time until the United States, partnering with the CIA, I guess you could say is really the CIA that trained paramilitary elements, right-wing paramilitary elements in the Indonesian military, and then overthrew the left-leaning Sukarno government and installed a fascist dictator. And that's what happens. That's what happens when indigenous people try to take control of their land, resources, and labor, which we call socialism. Agrarian reform, if you will. That is not to be tolerated by empire. That is not to be tolerated by the United States. You must be open to American capital accumulation. And even if you're on the fence, and remember that after World War II, there were two camps, then it became the Cold War. And you have the Soviet Union and the United States vying for control over the third world, as they called it, which is not necessarily a pejorative term. It was a more hopeful and optimistic term that third worlders labeled themselves as, because third world was sort of like the third estate. It was meaning that the global south was going to inherit the status of world power. And so it was the third world. It was the third and final act, where first it was kings and queens and the royalty, then it was the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and then now it's the third world is the working class. But that's not what happened. Hey, Maggie. You know, as it became known, and also, this is interesting, after World War II, you know, the United States has lucked upon, you know, the greatest position in world history, being, you know, an unbridled, unparalleled superpower. You know, in part because the rest of the world was decimated and the United States did not actually have an attack on its contiguous territory, but yet, you know, the main theaters of war were in, obviously, Europe and Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, but it, you know, didn't come to the United States mainland. Thank God we have two oceans that are separating us, so we kind of lucked into being able to not only like outproduce and outmanufacture all the rest of the world and basically provide all the logistics for fighting against, you know, the Axis powers, but you know, we just benefited. We were the clear out and out winners, I guess you could say. We sacrificed very little and we gained so much. And, you know, it's like when you learn about Harry Truman in 1935 as a senator, like right before the war broke out, he's saying, you know, if the Nazis start fighting the Soviets, we should arm the Soviets, and then if the Soviets start to win, we should arm the Nazis. Let them fight it out, let them kill as many of them as they can, because it'll help us. And so that's pretty, you know, revealing, I think. What happened to the beard? Stevie, I have a boy, if I got a story for you. There's this thing called a razor. Will you believe it's like a really sharp, very fine little blade, and it attaches to like this stem, and you can hold it in your hand. And when you do, you can, you know, put some cream on your face, and you can cut off the hair with the razor slowly. It's called shaving, anyway. So I embarked upon this journey of shaving, and this is what happened. This is what you see. Hope that was enlightening. Yes, I had cream all over my face. Thank you, Gorilla, for being aggressively horny in the chat. I really appreciate that. So didn't realize the origin of Third World was to differentiate capitalist, communist, anti. Yeah. Stop playing with my name. It was the Third World was. We're coming up. We're the third.
Stop playing with my name.
Stop doing that. Cherry Bab knows. Cherry Bab gets it. But, you know, it did take on a pejorative, you know, because in my estimation, because the United States decimated the Third World, it became associated with being third rate. So now we can say, oh yeah, the Third World. Yeah, the place that the United States, you know, bombed and sanctioned to death. And that's just a typical American response, is to just look at all the devastation that we caused and say, oh, look, you see, it's broken. Doesn't work. Even though, you know, just cleverly and conveniently forgetting that we specifically engineered those places to be this way. And it's just might makes right, right? It is, everything that is just because it happens to be that way. And if we didn't do it, somebody else will. It's good old Israeli settler logic. You heard that in a video. This Palestinian in the West Bank was like, you don't have to take my home. Please do not. You can't be here. This is my home. And he's like, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will. So anyway, I went on a little tangent.
While the highlighted areas on the map slowly faded and the US pulled back, the country's control over the world actually greatly increased as it calcified into a permanent, truly global military force. After the war, the US was standing at the summit of the world, according to Winston Churchill. Relatively unscathed compared to the destruction we saw in Europe and the overseas territories like the Philippines, the US, quote, made more goods, had more oil, held more gold, and possessed more planes than all other countries combined. It had one of the biggest militaries, controlled or occupied absurd amounts of land and people, and emerged on the winning side of the war without the same casualties as the USSR and the rest of the Allied forces. With its massive material wealth and million-strong army, the US could have easily done like every imperial power before it.
Bro, I am drugs, okay? I don't do drugs.
Acquiring more territories, maybe even annex major European nations and their colonies, incredibly weak after the war, and establish a new, truly global empire on the scale of something like the British.
It's Hitler.
But instead, the US did something surprising and gave up territory. Let go of the Philippines, stopped annexing new areas.
Yeah, because it's hard to conquer territory when people don't want you there. It's kind of misleading though, because with like something more sinister, you think that there's such a good spirit that they would have decolonized from the Philippines, but it's actually a little bit more sinister than that, because they realized they didn't actually need to control the territory, like I was saying earlier. That it didn't need to be a military occupation, but they could do, I think, what's known as Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease, contracts that the U.S. military made with these territories, and was able to basically lease, a 99-year lease for a military base. And, they just announced 4 more U.S. military bases in the Philippines. Just a number, within the Biden administration's term. So, we're still populating these places with bases, so it's not like we just gave up control out of the goodness of our own hearts, It's because the nature of empire has changed, and we have different ways to exercise effective control, and one of those ways is the way that I just told you, which is the Lend-Lease program, starting after World War II, where we just put military bases instead on these territories. And then another thing is that the indigenous population becomes dependent on the economy that the military provides, because all these military bases got soldiers, and soldiers need X, Y, and Z, it becomes a hub for military technology, because they become like little experimental training grounds for these new advanced technologies. Thank you, Gorilla, for the 10 gifted subs. Let's go, baby. All right. Now, if you're not providing me with sustenance, and so that my cat can continue licking his ass every day, and eating food that I buy him, then what are you doing? Okay? Support the stream, okay? If you don't give, it goes dark. And I think you know that. They figured out they can own the politicians and the military without having any of the responsibility or the accountability. Very good, Tandava. That's another thing is, another point that How to Hide an Empire brings up, which Daniel Immerwahr, which Second Thought is keen on, which he might mention, is that at the turn of the 20th century, around the time of Teddy Roosevelt, up to Woodrow Wilson, we became sort of ashamed of our imperial past, and the fact that it's like, do we really want to control? Because we had just acquired territories that the Spanish, which was one of the previous empires, or at least colonial powers, we basically inherited their territories, Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Philippines, I think, being chief among them. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, but like the 1898 war, and led to the subsequent occupation of the Philippines. That was the Philippine Liberation Movement, Army, whatever you want to call it. What was his name that started it? I'm blanking on it. But shit, it's gonna kill me not to know. But yeah, they were fighting against the Spanish. They, what does America do? They come in at the 9th hour and claim victory by helping the liberators, the Philippine Liberation, and then only to subsequently then become what the Spanish were to the Philippines. Now it's the Americans. talk you in or out of going to a 10-year reunion for $2, brother, of which half goes to, what's his name? The CEO of Google. I mean, I don't know if I mean, for 99 cents, I feel like, if I were you, I wouldn't go. I mean, what do you got to talk about with these people, okay? You don't want to be there. I wouldn't do it. All those, look, let those people be a part of your past. That was that chapter, all right, in high school. Okay, we don't need to continue living on in high school. High school's over, all right? Let's put the big boy pants on and do the adult thing and not go to the 10-year reunion. Okay? How'd I do? Hey, no problem. Anytime, anytime. I forgot what I was talking about. Opium War 1840, Boxer Rebellion 1901, collapse larger than China. Based on Philippines. I'm not sure quite what that means. It's not clear to me. But rent escorts in a nice car and go. Okay. Just a stunt on them hoes, huh? Just to be about a bitch. Just do it. Just floss on them, okay? Just be all extra. What's the link for the full song at the end of the clips? Yeah, it's the... oh, you want the link? It's... if you just type in my name and presidents... what is it? Presidents of the U.S. criminals. All the crimes. It's just, you know, all the crimes of the presidents. I have a full video on it. All my music's on Bandcamp as well. I am going to be doing other, more like YouTube content. I've got a little setup over there if you can't see. In front of the map there. And I do condom hummus. And I hope you do too, okay? That's all I'm saying. Nice. I like the sound of that, Cherry Bab. Cherry Bab is an artist as well. You guys should listen to her music. She's releasing singles all throughout this year, as I understand it. Still working on a new one, if I remember correctly. So drop us a link if you can. Let the people know. Let them hoes know. I'm just trying to stunt like my daddy, is all. All right, let's move on. Thank you, yeah, see, Maggie, there you go. Where you at? Maggie, you're actually good for something. That's awesome.
Gave up running entire countries, and even began echoing the Soviet Union's pro-decolonization rhetoric. Why?
Oh, thank you, Cherry Bab. I appreciate that.
Well, for starters, socialist, nationalist, or otherwise decolonial movements in Asia and Africa.
Socialist, nationalist, but not national socialist, okay? Wow, that's a lot of teeth. How'd you get all them teeth? They're pearly whites. Saeed, it's just to be ironical, okay? It's called sarcasm and irony. All right? It's just a little chuckle. All right? It's just for a laugh.
America made operating like the old empires just too costly for the West. Civil wars broke out, and countries were gaining independence almost everywhere you looked. In the face of this, fighting wars on dozens of fronts to set up new colonial administrations was not really an enticing future for US leadership when you can literally see the empires around you slowly losing their global dominance. Second, the emerging Cold War and the US's realignment against the USSR needed convincing rhetoric.
Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world.
Anti-colonial movements under the European empires just wouldn't ally with the US in its anti-communist project if they were going to be right back under a formal empire immediately after. Culturally, the USSR had successfully made anti-colonialism the moral high ground, and the US couldn't argue the opposite and get organic support. Most importantly, though, the US realized it just didn't need to be a formal empire and repeat old mistakes to reap imperial benefits. Why set up a colonial administration when a few bases and a little economic nudge would do?
There
Look
you
at
go.
this map. The first thing the US did after formally releasing some of its colonies and choosing not to acquire any more was to set up a global system of military bases. While the US already had a few of these set up, mostly in its own colonial holdings, the end of the war came with a huge boom in these installations around the world. Most surprisingly, outside of countries that the US laid a formal claim to or had recently let go of. Today, the US has around 800 bases all over the world. An approximate 173,000 troops are deployed in, we think, about 159 countries.
It can't be overstated, okay? There's nothing like it, you know? And our military budget is more than the next 9 countries combined in the top 10. So just keep that in mind, okay? When you just want to start talking shit about other countries.
None of these numbers are exact. We don't know for a fact every single base, airspace, lily pad, or other.
There's even black sites, okay?
US military installation out there, because a lot of that info is kept secret. According to Immervar's estimate,
top secret.
Though, we can put these numbers in perspective. There are only about 30 overseas military bases not owned and operated by the US in the entire world. Britain and France have 13, Russia has 9, and a few other countries have 1. Even if our numbers are way off, that's it for the rest of the world. There's just no comparison with the 800 sites the US maintains globally. So, how did this happen? See, the US didn't quite handle decolonial negotiations in total fairness or in line with its professed ideals of championing democracy around the world. Sure, it left the Philippines without much of a fight, but reconstruction came with a price. The country would agree to a few US military bases strategically placed near the countries it wanted to keep an eye on. Sure, Hawaii was granted statehood, but in exchange, the island of Koho'olawe was almost entirely turned over for military use as a training facility and gun range. Sure, citizens of Guam got more rights and citizenship after the war, but now over a quarter of the island is used for military bases today. Same goes for countries like Japan, Germany, and South Korea, who were all occupied by the US in some capacity and got the same treatment. They all have somewhere around 100 bases each today. Let's zoom out for a second and just imagine if the US experienced the same treatment. Imagine if tomorrow, foreign military forces, say from enemy states like China or Russia, were stationed all over the country or at various points near the border. It's probably not a comfortable idea, and for most countries out there, it's unfortunately the norm. And there's a point to the US having this kind of reach. These American bases all over the world serve a purpose. For countries with smaller militaries, these bases keep them surrounded. For our allies, American bases near or in their major cities keep these countries in line. These permanent sites with sometimes 100-year-long leases can serve many purposes for the US. They can easily be used either as a place to keep nuclear weapons pointed outwards, a central location for spying operations, or just a home for boots on the ground to protect nearby points of interest like oil wells in foreign nations that are supposed to be sovereign. In complete contradiction with the official messaging that says they're there to spread democracy or ensure peace, bases, unsurprisingly, often prompt the states they surround into ramping up their own military spending, increasing the threat of war in the process. In some cases, these bases simply serve as protection for the despots the US is aligned with, a permanent reminder that the US is just a step away if people start rising up against their government. Overall, these installations are there to keep these countries, basically every country on Earth with a base within or near its borders, in line with American corporate interests, preventing them from making sovereign decisions about what American politicians like to call our oil interests here in the US. Finally, these bases can also serve as the command center for disinformation campaigns. Take Swan Island, for example. During the 60s, the CIA ran a covert radio station out of these islands in the Caribbean. Posing as a private radio station, the agency blasted Cuba, the rest of the Caribbean, and a huge chunk of Latin America, something like 50 million listeners, with propaganda against Fidel Castro and the Cuban government. On Radio Swan, you could hear false news reports and even homophobic statements about politicians like Raul Castro, as the CIA used every method available to instigate a coup against the first Cuban government to have successfully kicked out American corporations. Corporations that, for decades, had enriched themselves off Cuba's sugar plantations and oil refineries while keeping the country's working people in a state of abject poverty under a US-backed puppet government. On a related note, these bases can also be used as launching points for invasions and wars at a moment's notice, or serve as coordination sites for foreign interference. Here again, the US is unmatched on the global stage. Since 1991, the US has launched over 250 military interventions by its own admission and made over 350 coup attempts since 1982. If any of this feels outdated or from a different era like the Cold War, here's John Bolton, former National Security Advisor in 2022.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics.
And here's James Woolsey, former CIA director in 2018.
Under their wing.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around in other people's elections, Jim?
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that too?
Yes, I'm muted. I know. Here I go. Yes, I'm a mute champ. I know, but I was saying, like, wow, awesome that they're just laughing about it. About their crimes against humanity. Very cool. Very cool. Very Fox News of them. Yeah.
Do a Vine video on this former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here. It's always great.
This
Always for a good cause. Always in the interest of democracy. Remember, when they say democracy, they mean capitalism. All right?
actually neatly transitions into the last pillar of American imperialism abroad: economic power. Since World War II, the global economy has been absolutely dominated by the US. Part of that is because the GDP of this country is massive. A lot of trade happens between the US and other countries. But that's only a small, declining part of the full-scale economic power of the US. Once again, after World War II, the US, along with the IMF and the World Bank, two institutions in which the US is the only country with veto power, by the way, went to work opening countries up to American money. Coups and territorial/military expansion weren't enough. Through policies like the Marshall Plan in Europe and conditional loans in the Global South demanding countries reduce their government spending and sell off their assets to American corporations, the US fashioned a global order in which American capital, much like the American military, could freely move in and out of most countries. While people are mostly stuck within their borders, American capitalists can now freely buy up assets or set up factories wherever they please. Meaning, wherever workers are the cheapest, labor laws are the weakest, and natural resources are the least well defended. All of that without needing to set up any official colonial government, just signing a couple free trade treaties and letting American money do the talking. This unprecedented access to the resources and wealth of other countries means that, by 2012, American companies owned 46% of all publicly listed shares of the top 500 corporations in the world. For a country representing about 4% of the world's population, this gives American CEOs unrivaled power and control over the wealth produced globally. And this is only compounded by the fact that since 1971, the US replaced the global gold standard with the American dollar. See, to participate in the global economy today, you pretty much need US dollars, particularly if what you're trying to buy is oil, which pretty much every country wants and is priced against the dollar. While countries can sometimes trade in their own currencies with some reciprocity, it often isn't possible to supply all your needs without using dollars. And this means that most countries' central banks are forced to add dollars to their international reserves if they want to have access to the outside world. Many countries are now, therefore, deeply embedded in American monetary policy, whether they want to be or not, allowing the US's ability to create new money or tweak interest rates to dictate massive chunks of the global economy in its favor with a single keystroke. And if all this wasn't enough, the final way the US flexes its economic power is through sanctions. Here again, nobody is on the US's level. Today, 1/3 of all nations and around 60% of all poor countries now face some form of US sanctions. In total, the US has some 15,000 active sanctions, 3 times as many as the next country and breaking all historical.
But no, guys, that's the free market, though. That's just the will of the free market, duh.
Records. This, and the fact that so much trade happens in dollars, means that denying access to the dollar, like many sanctions do, can completely cripple countries.
It's amazing how much A, capitalists love to espouse the free market, and B, how much they despise the free market.
Countries. Not just their economies, like we often hear it reported on the news. Sanctions, while often seeming much less dramatic than war, can be just as, if not more brutal for average people's livelihoods. The 60-year embargo on Cuba, for example, has meant that any company or country that wishes to trade with Cuba risks facing sanctions of their own. Faced with the choice between the massive market of the US and the tiny island of Cuba, most companies make the sensible decision. The consequence of almost everybody cutting Cuba off this way puts millions of lives at risk. And that's on purpose. In the US government's own words, the sanctions are there to, quote, decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger and desperation in the hopes that enough suffering will mean a coup against the Communist Party of Cuba. You already know that it hasn't worked. It's just meant people die without access to food, water, or medicine that is plentiful just outside the country's borders.
Who owns the world, chat? Who owns the world? Who rules the world? Answer: an array of mega corporations, often strategically linked in alliances, administering a global economy heavily reliant on state power to socialize risk and subdue recalcitrant elements. Did you get all that? So who rules the world? It's an array of megacorporations, often linked in strategic alliances, administering a global economy heavily reliant on state power to socialize risk and subdue recalcitrant elements. Now say it back to me.
Everywhere you look, this map just feels inadequate. Sandwiched between 2 other countries, on a continent far away from Africa, Asia, and Europe, the US looks small. It fades into the jigsaw puzzle of borders and ocean fronts. It doesn't seem like much. But this is not what the US is. It's this, and this, and this, an empire. An empire that has overstayed its welcome around the world. An empire that casually destroys millions of lives because it makes them money. Empires always make the same mistakes, and eventually, every empire falls.
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Clinton sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Obama gave the orders to do drone strikes.